Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today. Today, we're going to talk about ORCID APIs and custom integration. If you are not familiar with us, I'm sure most folks are already. So we have Sheila Raven here today, our lead strategist for research infrastructure programs. We also have Kayla Ramhit, our community specialist, and I'm Paolo Guhilde, senior strategist for the ORCID US community. Quickly, this is our agenda for today. We will have a quick overview of ORCID and the ORCID API. We will also look into what you can do with the ORCID member API. So the member API will be our main focus today. And Sheila will then go ahead and talk about planning and implementing custom ORCID API integration. So that's actually a big chunk of our conversation today. And then we will open it up to for a Q&A, and of course, we will have some next steps that you can take at your organization. All right, so if you are not familiar with ORCID, ORCID stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. There are actually three components of ORCID. The first one is the ORCID ID. So many of us probably here already have one. So an ORCID ID is a unique persistent identifier and it is free to anyone. So any researchers can have an ORCID ID. So if they don't have one, they can easily get one free of charge. What you can see here at the bottom of the screen, ORCID ID. And if you do click on that, that will take you to the second component of an ORCID. So the ORCID record is our second component. And with this, it is connected to the ORCID ID. So what you will see in the ORCID record is essentially what you would see in an online CV. You can take a look at your activities, affiliations, as well as your work, all in one place. So if we click on this, so this is essentially what you would see in your online profile or your online ORCID record. So it's got information about your email address if you want that to be publicly available, including also like links to a faculty webpage, perhaps. In my ORCID record, I actually include a link to my LinkedIn, for example. So that's definitely something that you can add. Again, like I mentioned, an ORCID record is similar to an ORCID CV or a CV essentially. So our volunteer researcher today, Sofia Maria Hernandez Garcia, has information about their employment information, their education and qualifications. They also have information about their professional activities. So that includes membership to, say, a professional association. You can also have information about service, have information about distinction, invited position, and the newest area or section entry that can be added to professional activities is editorial service. So if you're an editor of a journal, for example, you can add that to your professional activities. Other sections of the ORCID record also includes the funding section. So anything that you may have received for funding, you can add that to your ORCID record. There's also a section for resources, which are essentially information about, if you can think about like say in-kind contributions or let's say you've used a national laboratory equipment. So those information are in research resources. You can also add information about your works. Works is like a larger umbrella of pretty much products that you have produced as a researcher, for example. So that could be like publications, patents, images, musical compositions. So those can be added in the work sections. And finally, there's a peer review section. So if you are a peer reviewer of a journal, that can be added in the peer review section. I also want to mention that in the research resources as well as the peer review sections, these sections are available only in your ORCID record if an organization have pushed that information to your ORCID record. So with that, basically, that an organization is actively pushing that information to your ORCID record. Now, as a researcher, of course, a big part of this is that you as a researcher have control of your ORCID record. So you can add information to your ORCID record manually, for example. So you can add an affiliation manually. You can also add funding information manually. So all of this kind of information in your ORCID record can be added manually, except for the two section, which are the research resources and the peer review sections, which can only be added if an organization is pushing it actively to your ORCID record. As I mentioned, you have full control of your ORCID record. So as a researcher, so you as a researcher or your researchers, for example, at the university or research institute, have full control of their own ORCID record. And this includes how your ORCID record appears online. So you can set the visibility settings of your ORCID record. For example, you can change it to publicly available or change it to everyone. So that means it's publicly available. You can also change the visibility setting into trusted organizations only. So that means that your ORCID record is only available to the organizations that you have given permissions to. So that you have given them permission to access your ORCID record. You can also change that to only me. Only me really means that it's private only. So that means it's just you as a researcher can access that information or have pretty much have the view of that information. Now, like I said, you have full control of the entire ORCID record, but you can also control the different entries of your ORCID record. So it doesn't need to be all or nothing, right? So you can control, for example, an employment section or like say an entry in the employment. So for example, if I want to change the way this lyricist employment appears in my ORCID record, I can change the visibility settings of that to everyone, to public, or to limited access only, which means trusted parties only. And if I want it to completely not available online, I can change that to only me. So all of those really is now that we've kind of learned a little bit more about the ORCID ID and the ORCID record, we're going to jump into our conversation today, which is the third component of ORCID. And this is the application programming interface or the APIs, the ORCID APIs. And this is really kind of like the mediator or the function, the system or basically the tool that you want. So when you become a member of ORCID, you get access to the API. And probably a lot of you are already familiar with what an API does and how it works. But if you're not familiar with it, essentially a good analogy of an API is this. So let's say you're a customer at a restaurant and you make an order. So you order through the waiter. The waiter here is essentially your API. So you basically communicate to the waiter what you want as a customer. So this is what I want to order. And that waiter will communicate that to the chef. And the chef here are the databases in the back end, kind of putting together the dish that you want as a customer. And once that dish is done, the chef will then hand that to the waiter and the waiter will bring that to you. So there's a request of the order, and then there's the response of what you want, the order essentially. So this is the basic concepts of an API. In ORCID, for example, the API is really a way for organizations to connect with the researcher, or the researcher also connecting with the researcher. So, for example, a university as an employer would like to connect with the researcher. That researcher also connects with the employer. So there's a connection between the two, and then it can be exchange of the data, for example, in the ORCID record. So employer could grab affiliations or publications from the researcher's ORCID record, and the researcher can get an affiliated entry in their ORCID record from the university as an employer. All of these concepts will be discussed further later in this webinar. In ORCID, there are options for an API, for example. There are actually two APIs that you're probably going to get familiarized with. There's a public API and there's the member API. So if you are a member of ORCID, especially through the ORCID US community, you will get access to five ORCID member API keys. The public API have their own functionalities that they can do, and the member API have functionalities beyond what you can do with a public API, for example. And a big part of that is through towards here at the bottom, which is essentially reading limited access data. So the permissions that researchers are giving to organizations, right? And also like pushing data to ORCID, that's only available in the member API. So those are kind of the big differences between a public and a member API. Additional API concepts or ORCID API concepts that we would like to share with you all today are some of these examples here or these concepts here. And this will be, again, much more kind of discussed and we'll do a deep dive later on. So the first one is essentially authorization. So the ORCID OAuth process. So a researcher basically will connect their ORCID ID with your organization. And through that act of connection, they have to go through the authorization process and gives you, the organization, through your system, the permission to either read data from ORCID or to write data to ORCID or both, right? So those kind of permissions are have to be given to the organization. So this is what the OAuth process does. The permission has to be granted to the system, through the organization via the system. Once that permission has been granted, the organization can then go ahead and read limited access data, including also, of course, the publicly available data, and to also be able to write data if they do desire to do so. The other concept that we want to bring here, and again, this will be brought up again later on, is that the ORCID API is a REST API, which is essentially representational state transfer. It uses HTTPS, of course, to do the different calls. Some of these terminologies here, for example, the GET, very self-explanatory, right? Is that you're retrieving data. You can also do a post call, which is essentially you are creating a new data to somebody's ORCID record. You can also do a put call, and in this case, you're going to update the data that you just sent, for example. So existing data you're updating. And of course, you can remove a data through a delete call as well. Now, all of these ORCID API concepts, for example, it really helps a lot if you have somebody that are familiar with programming languages. So if you have a developer, of course, they can create different scripts to be able to put all of this together depending on what you want as an organization to do with ORCID. So you can either use Python, Java, or Ruby, for example, to do the different calls and scripts and to create an ORCID integration. When we get to the custom integration later on, this all of this will make sense and put all of this together, all of these concepts. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on to Kayla to talk more about what you can do with the ORCID API and the benefits of the ORCID API.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So I'm gonna share my screen. Are you able to see? Great. So like Paolo said, I'm going to talk us through what you can do with the ORCID Member API and some of the benefits of using the Member API. So there are a few different ways that you can use the Member API. Some of those are signing in with ORCID, collecting authenticated ORCID IDs, reading or pulling data from ORCID records into your systems, and then writing data back to ORCID records. And I'm going to go through each of these concepts, and in Sheila's presentation, she'll be going through in a lot more depth how all of that works together for a custom integration. So the first concept, using the member API to sign in with ORCID. So You can use ORCID to sign into many different systems with your credentials. So that way it makes it easier for your researchers. They don't have to remember multiple different usernames or passwords when signing into things like NIH, the National Library of Medicine for funding, or Stanford University's Open Neuro, or at Proposal Central logging in with their systems. So that's just an example of ways that the member API can help with that. Also, when collecting authenticated ORCID IDs. So Paolo mentioned that OAuth process earlier, and Sheila's going to really dive through each of those steps in detail. But the OAuth process is the way that organizations can collect those authenticated ORCID IDs, and that's possible with Member API. And the reasons for that is it can really help with disambiguation. Many researchers and people have similar or the same name. John Smith, for example, there are a lot of John Smith. And so the collecting that authenticated ORCID ID can help with making sure that you have the correct John Smith. It also can help with a researcher who is using different variations of their name. In this example, I have Paolo. He uses many different ways to say his name, or say you get married down the line, your last name changes, or something along those lines, that can help you make sure that the information and the person that you're following, you're getting the correct person as you're going through their record and getting that information from them correctly. And as I mentioned, it helps you stay connected with your researchers. So you can assess for impact and support your researchers. When they go through their career. So a lot of researchers, they may leave the organization, but that way you're still able to connect with them and see, well, what was the impact of the funding they did while they were at my organization? Or what was the impact of all the research and time they did with us? And how can we further support them? Using the Member API can help stay connected with them throughout their career so you can follow and see those different impacts and changes. The ORCID Member API can also help with reading data, and that's really about streamlining workflows and making things easier for you, your staff, and the researchers when they're filling out, say, forms or in evaluations or applying for funding. It just makes that process easier and more straightforward. And it really helps with that saving time and reducing administrative burden piece. For the researcher, they're saving time by not filling out. They don't have to fill out all their forms manually. There's a lot of forms they have to fill out over the course of their career and work. And this just helps with the click of a button. You don't have to do all of that manual typing. And it also helps mitigate those typing errors. You may accidentally type something incorrectly, for example. And so the Member API helps make sure that that doesn't happen by just pulling the information directly from their ORCID record. And it works the other way as well for the organizations, helps reduce the administrative burden of your staff time, teaching your researchers and helping them pull that information into the record. If they can just do it with the one button, then your staff can work on other projects and do the things that they are doing for their work. And then we get into the writing data back to ORCID records. And this is really about making sure that the information in an ORCID record is trustworthy and verified. And that kind of goes to this trust marker that you can find in the ORCID record. So trust markers are that visual representation in the ORCID record, that green check mark that shows, yes, this person, this researcher really does work at this university, or they really did receive that funding from, in this example, I have American Heart Association. Um, so that trust marker just helps to verify it. And it's really about that credibility and validity so that when you're pulling data from ORCID records, you know, yes, this information is credible and true. And it also is related to what Paolo mentioned before. There are some parts of the ORCID record that only organizations can write to, the research resources section, my apologies, and the peer review section of the ORCID record. Because those sections can only be written to by organizations, it also helps with meeting that for your researchers. And kind of, I mentioned that trustworthy and credibility. It kind of lends into that idea about making sure that metadata is more robust. And that also helps with ORCID working in conjunction with other persistent identifiers or PIDs. So there are many different PIDs that we use throughout the research ecosystem, and ROR, for example, Research Organization Registry for organizations. The POIs were probably very familiar with that for works or outputs. RAID, which is slightly newer, which is for projects. And then, of course, the discipline-specific PIDs like RRID, IGSN, and there are many, many others. But working in conjunction with all those PIDs can help not just with the discoverability of your researchers' research, but also with that robustness of the metadata to make sure that what you're pulling into your systems is credible, true, and verified. And it also can help with assessment. So we have an example here. The ORCID US Community has a data visualization tool. The way that this works is you can visualize publication collaboration data of your researchers, so who they might be publishing alongside from maybe another university or within your own university, and the way that you can assess and stay connected with your researchers when they publish can be done through the use of collecting ORCID IDs and then DOI outputs and visualizing them. In this example, we have a dashboard and this map here where you can see where all that collaboration activity is around the world. So now that we've sort of talked about how the member API works and some of those benefits, we're going to go into the types of different ORCID member API integrations. So there are three types of member API integrations. There's the ORCID Affiliation Manager, which is only for ORCID consortium members, and that's really about pushing or writing affiliation data. So that would be employment, education, qualifications, other professional activities. Paolo went through some of that. So that's what the ORCID Affiliation Manager can do. There's also the vendor or open source system integration. So that has two different kinds. Essentially, what a vendor or open source system is, you may have many systems you're using at your organization, like symplectic elements. Some of them have ORCID functionality built in. And you can integrate with those systems that have that functionality to do pull information, read information, and then also write information back to your record. And there are two different kinds of systems for ORCID. There's the certified ORCID service providers, and these systems more or less have worked with ORCID and they meet some of those requirements from ORCID. And then there's the non-certified, and that just means that they have ORCID functionality. It just might not be complete, or they might be missing certain things. But then that lends into the third, which we're going to spend most of our time today talking about, which is the custom integration. It's possible that you may have a system that either doesn't have ORCID functionality built in or may not have what you're looking for, and that's where the custom integration comes in. You can sort of customize that. So I mentioned the vendor open source, so I'm going to briefly talk about the common systems for ORCID integration. So this is another way to find out what systems you are using at your organization and what they might have built in for ORCID functionality. And there are many different types of systems you can look at. So there's grant management systems, institutional repositories, publishing systems, peer review, data management, research information management systems. And you can go through the common systems for ORCID integration to find out where you are at your organization, what you have available to you, and that can help you decide if you need to move forward with a custom integration. And I will stop there and I will pass things on to Sheila to talk about custom integrations.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's get into it. Planning and implementing custom ORCID API integrations. So when you're kind of trying to decide what to do, that common systems list or Trello board that Kayla shared will be really helpful. You can kind of take an inventory of what type of software systems are you using at your organization, and that can kind of help guide you through a decision-making process that may result in you wanting to do a custom integration. So you can start by looking at any vendor or open source systems that you're using, check the list, see if they're integrated with ORCID or not. If they're not, you might want to do a custom integration. Or if you're using any homegrown systems, that's another pathway where you might want to do custom integration. And of course, we'll be sharing the slides after this session so you can look closer at this decision tree. But just to give you an idea, things to consider. Again, if you're using homegrown systems, you'll definitely want to do a custom integration. Vendor or open source systems that maybe don't already have the ORCID API functionality built in, or maybe that functionality doesn't meet your needs fully, that's a good case for considering to go custom. And also custom integrations can be much more helpful for enabling a strategic flow of data across different systems at your organization. A lot of the times, for example, like a vendor research information management system can just be a little bit siloed just within that system. But if you want to have certain data going to other parts of your organization, a custom integration can really help with that. Custom integrations do require internal planning and technical development, so you'll definitely need a developer or a programmer to actually do the work of building the integration. But there are some decisions that you'll need to make internally before you get started, and we'll talk about those. But the trade-off is that the custom integrations it really can be designed to fully meet your needs when it comes to ORCID, and you can have the flexibility that you are looking for depending on what kind of data you might want to read or write or sync between ORCID and your local systems. And we do have a custom integration guide that we'll share the link to in the chat that walks through a lot of these things as well. So some of the questions to start asking when you're doing this planning and thinking about what you want to do for your integration, think about the researchers that you're working with and which researchers you're interested in connecting with their ORCID. So it could just be if you employ researchers, it could be all of the employed researchers. If you're at a university, for example, you might just want to focus on faculty, or you might want to start with grad students, for example, or only researchers receiving funding. Of course, if you're at a funding organization or a publisher, you're only going to be interested in those researchers that you're actively working with. Some organizations have focused on researchers in certain departments and kind of gone one by one. So the audience, I guess, is an important thing to start thinking about. And also what kind of data you might be interested in retrieving from these researchers' ORCID records. A lot of organizations have these reporting cycles where researchers have to report on their activities every year or every so often. So if you can encourage your researchers to keep that information up to date in their ORCID records, you could pull that data out of ORCID. So thinking about the data that you would be interested in reading from ORCID is another thing to consider. And also writing data to ORCID. When you're thinking about this, it's important to think about what kind of information about your researchers do you already have at your organization that you can essentially verify is true. That's the data that you would be most likely wanting to push to those researchers' ORCID records to verify and confirm their relationship with your organization. So thinking about all of these things can help you start to make some decisions about what you want to do with your integration. And that all kind of culminates in what you want to be able to do with ORCID. We talked about using ORCID to allow people to sign in to a software system. That might be a use case for you. Most organizations really start their interest with just wanting to collect the researchers' authenticated ORCID IDs so they have the right ORCID ID for each person. And so that's a pretty common one. And you can't really do the following ones without getting those authenticated ORCID IDs. So if you want to read data from your researchers' ORCID records, if you want to write data, I will say writing data to ORCID is one of the most important and helpful things ORCID member organizations can do to contribute that trustworthy data back into the ecosystem and help their researchers keep their ORCID records up to date. And of course, if you want to keep data in sync between your local systems and what's on your researchers' ORCID records. These decisions will determine essentially what permissions you need to ask your researchers for through the API, through the OAuth process. And when we're talking about the ORCID OAuth permission process, these permissions are called scopes. So the scopes we're going to look at today are the ones that require permission or authorization from your researchers or your users. The first one is just authenticate. So that allows you to get that researcher's ORCID ID. And also built in with that is just the ability to retrieve or read public data from that researcher's ORCID record. There's also a read limited scope. So any information that your researchers have set to that trusted parties only visibility that we saw earlier, you'll need that explicit permission from them to read that data. So there's a read limited scope that you can use. And then there's two scopes that pertain to writing data to ORCID, and it kind of depends on what kind of data you want to write to ORCID. So there's activities update, and that's for any of the kind of activities that are listed in the main section of the ORCID record. So any of the affiliations, funding information, works, professional activities, research resources, and peer review. And then there's person update, which are more of the smaller pieces of information like other names or keywords, countries, websites. So for example, faculty profiles, you can write those links to your researchers' ORCID records as well. So keep that in mind, and we'll be coming back to this when we do a walkthrough of how the OAuth process works. Now, just some background information on ORCID development and how it works. Basically, ORCID has a sandbox environment and a production environment. The sandbox environment is basically just like the production environment, but there's no real people or real data in there. It's just for development and testing purposes, whereas the production environment, that's what we're all familiar with our actual live ORCID IDs and our actual information there. And so you'll want to do all of your development and testing in the ORCID sandbox. Once you've done that development and testing and everything's working correctly, we'll do an integration review. So if you're an ORCID US community member, you'll contact us to do that integration review. And that just is to make sure that you're meeting all of the minimum best practices for ORCID. And then you can go to production after you've passed the integration review. So getting started, you're going to need some sandbox API keys. And you'll need some sort of user-facing web page or portal where your researchers can go to connect their ORCID ID with your organization or your system. You'll need some sort of secure database on the back end where you're going to be storing your researchers' ORCID IDs and other detailed information, including access tokens that need to be kept secure. And then you will need the ability to set up ORCID API calls to read and write data from ORCID to and from ORCID. So the sandbox API keys, basically when we say API keys, it's a client ID and a client secret. There's a form online that you can fill out to request your sandbox API keys. And this just is giving you an example of what your client ID and your client secret will look like. They will look similar to this. You'll want to keep your client ID on hand and keep your client secret in a secure place as well. And do not share that, because if it gets compromised, you'll need to get a new one for security purposes. So when you're thinking about the user-facing web page or portal where your researchers are going to go to connect their ORCID ID with your organization, that's one of the first steps. You might already have an existing web page that you want to add this to, or you might be creating something new. But regardless, you'll want to also use that page to generally explain what ORCID is, the benefits of it, why you're asking people to connect their ORCID ID with your integration. These are a few examples of what a ORCID portal or ORCID connection page could look like. The one on the left is from the University of Arizona. The one on the right here is from William and Mary. You can see that they both have information about what is ORCID and why are we using ORCID. And they both have this create or connect ORCID ID button with the ORCID branded ID icon there. And that's basically what you want your researchers to click on to initiate the ORCID connection process. So that Create or Connect ORCID button just kind of high level overview. Essentially, when a researcher clicks on that button, behind that button is what we call an ORCID authorization URL that looks something like this. And it's just a standard kind of template, but there are three components of the authorization URL that you're going to need to fill in specific to your integration. The first component is your client ID. So you'll just insert your own client ID there that you got when you requested your sandbox credentials. The scopes. So this is where you specify what permissions you want to ask your researchers for. And you can see here that we're using the read limited scope and the activities update scope. And that will translate to permissions that you're asking for. And then finally, a redirect URI. This is basically just wherever you want your users to be redirected after they go through the ORCID connection process. So you will construct your ORCID authorization URL and have it basically behind a Creator Connect ORCID button. So when your user clicks on that Creator Connect ORCID button, they'll get a pop-up prompting them to sign in to their ORCID record if they already have one. If they don't already have an ORCID record, they can click on the Register Now button on that pop-up screen, and they can go through and very quickly create an ORCID record at the same time that they're going through this process. Once they've signed in, then the ORCID authorization screen will pop up, and this is built in. You don't have to build it yourself, but basically this will pop up based on the authorization URL that you used. So let's look a little bit closer at the authorization screen and what's there. First, you'll have your the user's name and their ORCID ID. So for the actual user, this will confirm that they're logged into their account. They will see the name of the organization or the platform that they're making the connection with. And then here is where those scopes that you used in your authorization URL will show up on the user side. So here the organization has asked for the following access to your ORCID record, read your information with visibility set to trusted parties, and add or update your research activities. So these are the permissions that the researcher is granting, and this will look different depending on what scopes you used in your authorization URL. And then finally, there's the authorize access button. So when the user clicks that, they're authorizing the access. That permission that they're granting by default lasts for 20 years. So you can stay up to date with researchers, maybe even after they've left your organization. Now on the user side, once they click that authorize access button, they're pretty much done with the process. It's that easy for them. They can always go back and log into their ORCID account. And when they do that, there's a trusted parties tab when they're logged in. And there they can see all of the different organizations or platforms that they've made this ORCID connection with. And do notice that the user can revoke the access that they just gave you permission. They can revoke that at any time. And that's their choice because they have full control over their own ORCID record. But if they don't revoke that access, you will have that permission for 20 years. Now on your side, in your application where you're doing this integration, after the user clicks authorize access, basically the user's ORCID ID, their access token, and a few other pieces of information are transferred from ORCID to your application. So the information that your application receives is going to be the person's name as it appears on their ORCID record, the person's authenticated ORCID ID, so you know you have the right ORCID ID for that person, a unique access token for that person that will need to be kept secure, because basically the ORCID ID and the access token are the two pieces of information that you're going to need to do the API calls to read and write data. You'll also get some additional information that clarifies the scopes that were authorized. You'll get a refresh token in case for whatever reason you need to refresh the access token. And this expires is basically 20 years in seconds. ORCID recommends that you store all of this in a secure database, but especially the ORCID ID and the access token. Once you have those authenticated ORCID IDs, we do recommend that you use them and display them wherever it makes sense. So we've got some examples here of these ORCID IDs being displayed on like faculty profile pages. This example is from Boston College. We have an example here from Brandeis University, and this is actually a professor of music. So ORCID can be useful for any discipline, not just the hard sciences. Here's an example from Stanford. And beyond that, publications, items in a repository, anywhere where you have somebody's name, you can add their authenticated ORCID ID to just confirm and bring more visibility to those researchers. Now, if you want to read data from ORCID records, you can do that now that your researchers have gone through this OAuth process and you have their ORCID IDs and access tokens. So there are various API calls. ORCID has a whole tutorial on how to read data from ORCID records. But just to give you an overview, you can read a full, like a summary of somebody's ORCID record. You can pull data from specific sections, like the work section or the funding section, or you can just get the entire ORCID record. Um, Here is an example of what an API call would look like if you're using curl and the command line. So we have the get method here. You would insert the access token for that person here. And then here we have the URL where you would insert the person's ORCID ID and then the endpoint or the type of information that you want to read from that person's ORCID record. So this is all happening like machine to machine. And programmatically. On kind of the user-facing end, this is an example of reading data from ORCID and using that data in another application. So this is the North Carolina State University Citation Index, where they are pulling works information from ORCID and displaying it in their citation index. And you can see here that this particular work, the source came from ORCID. So that's just an example of reading data from ORCID record. If you want to write data to somebody's ORCID record, you would have had to use either the activities update scope or the person update scope, but as long as you have those permissions, you can write those pieces of data to someone's ORCID record. You will need to do the API call, but with writing data to ORCID, you also need either an XML file or a JSON file that contains the actual information that you want to push to ORCID, and I'll show an example of that. And really, the only section of the ORCID record that you can't write to with the API is the biography section. Only the researcher can add their own biography. So here's an example of an API call to write to ORCID. We can see that we're using the post method here. And you would insert the access token, insert the link to your either XML file or JSON file containing the information that you want to write to ORCID. And then in the URL, you would specify the person's ORCID ID and the section of the ORCID record that you want to write to. In this case, it's employment. And then on this side, this is just an example of a snippet of XML that contains the actual employment data that you want to add to the person's ORCID record. And ORCID has a API 3.0 guide that has a lot more examples and all of the endpoints and all of the information that you would need to do this work. And then on the graphical user interface side, this is what it looks like when you write data to ORCID records using the API. The source will be the name of your institution or the name of your application. We already saw a few examples of this, but just to reiterate here, this makes sure that the data is trustworthy because it's been added by your organization. Now, just a few additional things that you need to know. Every data entry in an ORCID record has something that's called a put code, whether the individual added that information themselves or if it was added by you through the API, there will be a put code associated with that entry. And that is what you would use if you wanted to read full details from a single entry on somebody's ORCID record, or if you wrote information to somebody's ORCID record and you want to be able to make an update to that metadata, you're going to need that put code. It is important to note that only the entity that wrote the data entry to ORCID can make changes to that entry. So if I added something manually to my own ORCID record, I'm the only person that can make changes to that entry. Similarly, if you're using the API to write data to somebody's ORCID record, you're the only entity that can make changes to that. So keep that in mind. And again, the full ORCID API guidance and examples can be found in the ORCID API guide on GitHub. All right, so I mentioned that the process for development is working in the sandbox first, then doing an integration review, and then going to production. So for integration reviews, these are the minimum requirements that your integration has to meet in order to go to production. And you would basically just contact us to schedule and go through this integration review. But basically, the requirements are that you need to use the OAuth process to get authenticated ORCID IDs. It's really not a good idea to have anybody typing in manually or allowing users to make edits to their ORCID number. You want to get the ORCID number from the API to make sure it's correct. Once you have ORCID IDs, if they're publicly displayed, make sure you're using ORCID's display guidelines. Make sure you're storing the ORCID IDs and access tokens at minimum securely. Use HTTPS for your redirect URIs and API calls. And if your organization is going to be writing data to ORCID, we need to make sure that you're going to store those put codes so that you can make changes to those entries later if needed. So again, we have our custom integration guide that will walk you through all of the steps and link out to more detailed documentation about how to do everything. And just note, once you launch your integration, you will want to let your researchers know about it so they can use it. And we've got an outreach planning guide that can help you think through that component of doing the outreach to your researchers to make sure they know about it. And we also have guides if you're not interested in custom integration, or maybe you're also interested in turning on some vendor integrations, we have a guide for that too. And also there's a guide for the affiliation manager. But also, if you can't find what you're looking for, don't hesitate to contact us. We do have a few events coming up that you might be interested in. First, coming up on August 11th, we're going to be doing a next steps conversation for the ORCID US community, where we're going to go deeper into ORCID API and how data can flow through different systems at your organization. So that will be more of a discussion. You can bring your questions. And we'll just have more of an informal discussion there where we can dig a little bit deeper and more case by case questions. And then on August 19th, we're going to be having an ORCID 101 workshop. It's especially for researchers, but also just for anyone who wants to know more about ORCID. We're going to be covering the basics of the ORCID ID, the ORCID record, and tips and tricks for ways that researchers can keep their ORCID records up to date more easily. So please feel free to join us for those. And with that, I think we do have about 7 minutes for questions, which we can take that time, but also do not hesitate to contact us at orcidus@lyrasis.org with any really specific questions or if there's anything that we ran out of time for today. All right, do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you, Sheila. So one of the questions that actually just came in is about information on
Mm,
digital commons. And,
mm,
as you know, digital commons doesn't have an ORCID integration, but can you
mm.
just talk a little bit more about it? And we will share some information via chat as well.
Yeah, so Digital Commons, because it's a vendor system, it is really up to the vendor to make sure they have an ORCID integration. We do a lot of advocacy. ORCID also does. They reach out to vendors to try to encourage them to do ORCID integrations and get certified. But unfortunately, Digital Commons is one of the vendors that just really has not done these integrations with ORCID yet. Um, for several years now, they've been saying that they were going to, but we haven't really seen that. So the best thing you can do if you are using Digital Commons or any other vendor system that doesn't integrate with ORCID is to just relentlessly contact them as a customer and say, hey, we really need ORCID integration. We really need ORCID integration. Um, and hopefully that will help them understand that they need to do it. If it was something that we could do or that ORCID would do, that would be great, but we do have to rely on the actual vendors to integrate ORCID into their systems. That said, if you're using Digital Commons or other systems that aren't integrated with ORCID and you have a developer at your organization that could potentially work on a custom integration, there could be ways to have kind of like a sidecar ORCID integration, and then you could take those ORCID IDs, for example, from your integration and like display them in Digital Commons or something along those lines. And that's where if you want to contact us, we could have a call to explore some of those options. But yeah, I see Sigurd's comments. You've been asking them for years. But yeah, just keep asking, keep putting pressure on them, and hopefully they will do it. Yeah, I think Digital Commons they're using like the public ORCID API to do some things, but they aren't using the functionality that we just looked at where the user actually connects their ORCID ID with the platform. Um, so yeah, hopefully that helps. Any other questions?
Great. Thank you, Sheila.
Yeah.
I actually just, you now should be able to unmute and also share your video if you like. So feel free to also just raise your hand or ask questions live instead of the chat.
We did
Um,
get one in Q&A.
oh,
Yeah, I
great. Thank
just saw
you.
that. Thanks, David. Okay, so for a publisher to push peer review information to an ORCID record, they would need to have a membership and API key. Correct. That is correct. Are there a lot of publishers doing this or just a few for now? Um, in my experience, what I have found is that a lot of publishers are doing this peer review pushing to ORCID through Web of Science. It used to be through Publons, and then Publons became part of Web of Science. And so, but most publishers are also ORCID members, and they're collecting those authenticated ORCID IDs from authors. But yeah, it's hard to say how many publishers are doing it, but I would say most of the peer-reviewed scholarly journals that are out there, especially from the big commercial publishers, but also there are some like library press open journals that are doing it. Uh, OJS, Open Journal Systems, has that functionality built in. So if you're hosting any journals on OJS, you can get the peer reviewers' ORCID IDs and push peer review information to ORCID through OJS. Um, so yeah, I would say a large majority of journals are doing it, many of them through Web of Science, but they also have their own, like Web of Science is a member of ORCID, but also all of these publishers are also members of ORCID. And I would say for all of the scholarly journals, majority of them are doing it. There may be a few small journals here and there, humanities and social sciences, or maybe arts and humanities more so might not be doing it. So it also kind of depends on discipline. But yeah, hopefully that helps. And our common systems Trello board, if you go to the OJS card, you can see more information about that functionality. And same thing for the Web of Science too. Okay, any other last minute burning questions? Well, thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to come to our webinar. Hopefully you learned something maybe that you didn't know. Please feel free to always contact us at orcidus@lyrasis.org if any questions come up later. Otherwise, we will be sharing the slides and the recording shortly, so stay tuned for that. And thanks again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And maybe we'll see you at one or both of our events in August. Thanks, everyone.